That hug never actually happened. As his arms reached out, I pulled back instinctively, not even fast enough to hide it. My whole body winced away like it belonged to someone else, and his hand caught the sleeve I had rolled up earlier. I yanked it down fast, but I was half a second too late. At first, he didn't say a word. He just stared down at my wrist, then raised his eyes to meet mine. Torch. In that split second, something in his face went completely still. It was a dead, heavy silence, far more unnerving than if he had started screaming. 12 years can do a lot to a man. His shoulders were broader than I remembered, his temples were dusted with gray, and his face was marked by the intense Colorado sun and wind. All those years I wasn't around for. Torch. But it was that cold quiet that told me he wasn't the same brother who had left for the West all those years ago. The old Emery would have laughed, picked me up, and spun me around. The Emery standing on my porch in the Atlanta suburbs was just silently studying me. "Are you okay, Eleanor?" he finally asked, his voice soft and probing. "I'm fine," I blurted out. Torch. It was a reflex I had spent the last year perfecting. "My name is Eleanor Vance." And until that humid summer afternoon, behind the shut front door of my home in this quiet middle-class neighborhood, no one truly knew what my version of fine actually looked like. He didn't move for a long moment. The bug zapper on the porch hummed softly overhead. Torch. A Ford SUV drifted past on the street behind him, but neither of us turned to look. All I could hear in my head was my husband Arthur's voice, using that same tired tone. "Don't make a scene, Eleanor. Think of the children's reputation." Out of a 12-year habit of swallowing every piece of pain, I almost said those exact same words to my own brother. "Torch. If you're listening to this right now, tell me what time it is where you are." As I lay all of this bare, it helps to know someone is out there listening, because this isn't easy to talk about. Emery reached out again, slow this time. He gently turned my wrist toward the overhead light. Torch. The edges of the bruise were already fading into a sickly greenish yellow, an old mark, but underneath it lay deeper, darker shades of fresh purple. He didn't gasp, he didn't curse. He just stared at it with the cold focus of a doctor reviewing a report that confirmed his worst fears. "Who did this?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud or panicked. It was dead calm. Torch. It was the tone of a man who already knew the answer was going to cost him something, but was ready to pay it anyway. I opened my mouth, ready to deliver the excuse I had rehearsed in front of the mirror for months. I tripped. I bumped into a cabinet door. It's really no big deal, but the words choked in my throat. Looking at him, I just couldn't say them. Torch. For 12 years of letters and FaceTime calls, I had told him everything was wonderful, that the house was great, the family was thriving, and that everything was perfect after Arthur's son, Derek, and his wife moved back close to us. The silence dragged on so long that a moth found the porch light and began blindly bumping against it. Torch. I kept my eyes locked on that moth, avoiding Emery's face, because I couldn't look him in the eye and lie. "Derek," I finally whispered, my voice snapping on the second syllable, "and Chloe." The muscle in his jaw flexed slightly. That was the only movement in his entire body. "And Arthur just stood there," I added, my voice barely a rustle. He stood there and watched it happen. Torch. I hadn't intended to say that last part, but it spilled out anyway, thin and weak, like it had been waiting behind my teeth for an entire year just to find a way out. Emery didn't answer right away. He just kept holding my wrist with that same gentle grip, like it was fragile glass, and he had only just realized he was responsible for keeping it from breaking. Torch. He held my wrist and guided me inside the house. His grip was firm, almost like he was worried that if he let go, I would take back the truth I had just handed him. The pendant lights over the kitchen island were far brighter than the porch light. In that sharp glow, I felt an uncomfortable exposure I hadn't felt outside. "Tell me everything," he said. It wasn't a request. Torch. It was an open door he was holding for me. The truth came out in jagged pieces, hardly a clear story at all. How Derek swore that signing over the title of the Chevy pickup was just a temporary tax move. How Chloe started stepping over the line, opening my mail and bank statements before I even saw them. Porch. And then 3 months ago, on a Sunday right at this dining table. Back when it was still my table. Chloe slid a stack of papers toward me. She used that sweet, irresistible tone typical of wealthy Atlanta housewives to tell me it was just a formality. Just paperwork Arthur needed to refinance the mortgage. I remember saying I wanted to read it first. Porch. I remember the look that flashed across Derek's face the moment those words left my mouth. I told Emery about the rough grip on my arm that day. How Derek gritted his teeth, telling me I was being difficult and holding the family back. I told him how the pen was knocked from my hand and how I never picked it back up. Porch. Because by the time I came to my senses, I had already signed another paper. A concessions made simply to end the suffocating tension in that room. Emery didn't interrupt me once. He stood leaning against the marble counter with his arms crossed. He was so motionless that I found myself staring at his chest just to make sure he was still breathing. Porch. When I finally ran out of words, he stayed silent for a long time. Then he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, but it wasn't cruel either. It was the look of a man running dark calculations in his head, growing more disgusted with the answer every second. It was a smile that meant he had made up his mind and was just waiting for his mouth to say it out loud. Go pack a bag, he said. Porch. Emery, I can't just... You can. It's my house, and Arthur is my husband. If I just leave without a word, what will the neighbors think? What will people in the community say? What about them? His tone wasn't harsh, just completely final. Let them think whatever they want. I went upstairs anyway, fighting myself every step of the way. Porch. I packed slowly, my hands making decisions before my brain could catch up. I grabbed my mother's vintage brooch, but forgot a second pair of shoes. I left our wedding photo on the dresser, flipping it face down. Maybe I didn't mean anything by it, or maybe that was the loudest statement I could make. I picked up the cardigan Derek always mocked for making me look like an old country woman. Porch. Out of a petty spite I was almost ashamed to admit. I put it down, then shoved it right back into the bag. Downstairs, Emery was already on the phone. His voice was low and fast, settling details I couldn't quite catch. When he hung up, he looked at my small bag with a quiet, painful understanding, seeing clearly how little I had allowed myself to take over the years. Porch. One more thing, he said as he held the door of his Ford truck open for me. I don't want Arthur knowing where we are. Not yet. He's still my husband. I know what he's like, I said softly without anger. I know how easily Derek manipulates him when things get tough, too. Until I know whose facade Arthur is really on, I'm not giving him this address. I wanted to argue. Porch. But I didn't have the strength left in me. I got into the truck, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I let someone else decide what was safe. When I woke up the next morning, I checked the door lock before I even checked the time. My hand was on the deadbolt before my eyes were fully open. Porch. It was a habit built over a year of mornings, even if my rational mind knew nobody was going to break in here. But habits don't care about logic. They just demand that the door stays locked. The guest room was too big, too quiet. I lay in bed for another minute, straining my ears for sounds that weren't there. No heavy footsteps in the hallway. No low voices downstairs plotting what to do with me. Porch. I pulled out my phone and texted Arthur from under the covers. I am safe. Don't worry about me, I didn't say where I was. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, wanting to add something else, but I forced myself to place the phone face down on the nightstand. Downstairs, Emery had already brewed coffee. Sitting at his solid wood dining table was a woman with a leather briefcase beside her. Porch. She looked at me with an evaluating eye. The kind of look that makes you feel like you're being measured for armor. Eleanor, this is Sarah Jennings, Emery introduced. She's an attorney specializing in elder law. I don't need a lawyer, I blurted out, pulling back instinctively. I just want my house back. Sarah didn't flinch at my resistance. Porch. She had a voice naturally built to deliver hard truths gently, and that was exactly how she spoke. What you went through in Georgia has a clear legal definition. It's called financial exploitation, and depending on what our investigation uncovers, it could qualify as abuse. Either way, Eleanor, this isn't just a family dispute anymore. It's a crime. Torch. Those words hit the table heavy, like a weapon I desperately didn't want to pick up. They're my family, I argued. Derek has just been under a lot of stress lately because of his failed startup. Chloe can just be controlling sometimes. And Arthur just stood there. Emery interrupted quietly, repeating the exact words I had handed him the night before. I had nothing left to say. Torch. I made a call earlier, Sarah said. The county has a forensic nurse examiner who handles elder abuse cases on call 24/7. Given your age and what you described, she agreed to come see you directly this morning, skipping the usual bureaucratic delays. The nurse arrived within an hour. Professional, calm, and unhurried. She asked if she could examine the marks I had shown Emery on the porch. Before I could overthink it, I said yes. She pulled out a small ruler, placed it beside my wrist as a scale, and took photos. In the same flat voice you'd use to read a grocery list, she documented the layers of bruising, the old greenish-yellow marks and the fresh purple ones over them. It should have felt cold, but instead, something cracked open in my chest. Hearing a professional put it all into an official record made it real. It shattered the lie I had been telling myself for a whole year to make it seem smaller than it was. How long has this been going on? She asked. I opened my mouth, ready to say, it's really not that bad. It was a phrase I had used so many times the edges were worn smooth. Instead, I heard myself say, almost a year. She didn't react with drama. She just kept writing. After the nurse left, Sarah stepped into the next room to make a call. I wasn't meant to hear it, but the house was so quiet her voice carried clearly. She was filing a report with Adult Protective Services. She stated my name, my age, and assigned a case number I hadn't asked for. She used the word urgent. She mentioned an ongoing risk of harm. I sat frozen at that table, listening to a stranger describe my life to another stranger. For the first time, I truly understood that this was no longer a private family matter I could fix behind closed doors. It belonged to other people now. People with case files, forms, and the authority to walk through my door without knocking. I didn't know yet whether that made me feel more terrified or finally saved. The woman sitting across the table from me was named Rachel, an investigator from Sarah's firm. She had a laptop, a legal pad, and a calm way of not staring right at you, which made me trust her far more than if she had tried to smile and comfort me. Mrs. Vance, she said, finally meeting my gaze. I keep my investigations quiet. No drama, no surprises, just facts. Emery had already filled her in the night before. She was starting with the records I authorized her to check, my own bank accounts and personal files. Sarah slid a release form over and I signed it without hesitation. My handwriting was firmer than it had been in months. It was such a small thing. Signing because I wanted to, not because someone was standing over my shoulder forcing my hand. I hadn't realized how much I missed feeling in control. Rachel worked quietly for a while. The only sound was the clack of keys and the occasional soft hum when she found something. Then she turned the laptop screen toward me. Do you recognize this? It was a medical power of attorney form. My signature was at the bottom, dated 6 weeks ago. I remembered it instantly. A private clinic. My hands had been shaking from a blowout argument with Derek the night before. Chloe had been standing right next to me, her presence so suffocating that I rushed through the paperwork, just to escape that waiting room and get somewhere I could breathe. I remember this, I said. It's real. I signed it. You did, Rachel said. Now look at what's attached right behind it. She scrolled down. Following the page I remembered was a second page, terms I had never read, never seen. It granted extensive control over my financial and legal affairs to someone else. My signature was printed neatly at the bottom of that page, too. But I was certain as you know your own handwriting, that I had never seen those words until this moment. I know the first page. My voice came out weaker than I wanted, pointing at the screen, but I didn't know about the second one. The room fell quiet. The muscles in Emery's jaw tightened again. This isn't about memory loss, Sarah said gently. George. Someone added extra pages to a document you actually signed. That's a completely different issue, and a much easier crime to prove. I sat in silence, processing it. This was worse than being careless. It wasn't that I was forgetful. It was that an ordinary form I trusted had been used as a backdoor to take control of my life. I want to call Arthur, I said. I want to ask him if he knew. George. Not yet. Sarah stopped me. Whatever he says right now, we can't verify. If he wasn't involved, warning him early might tip off Derek. Give it a few days. I hated how logical she sounded, but I nodded anyway. Rachel scrolled again, focusing on a new target. Her expression shifted into that hesitant look people get right before delivering bad news. There's one more thing, she said. George. Give me a day. I want to be 100% sure before I show you. She half closed the laptop as if she couldn't stand to look at it either. When I came downstairs the next morning, Rachel was already at the table. Her laptop was open, her face carefully composed. Sarah wasn't sitting. She stood behind Rachel's chair. Before anyone spoke, that setup told me today was going to be worse. George. The pickup truck, Rachel began. The one Derek's been driving. I knew the truck. Dark blue, far newer than anything Derek could afford on his modest income. He had told me he bought it cheap from a former coworker moving out of state. I had even stood in my driveway, praising the truck, genuinely happy for him. It was registered in your name, Rachel said. Until 3 weeks ago. George. Then someone used that same power of attorney form to transfer the title into his own name. I stared at the screen, unable to process the numbers. Every week he lived under my roof, I bought the best groceries for him. I muttered to myself. I made up the guest bed with my mother's handmade quilt. I told everyone at church how proud I was of him, how wonderful it was to have family close. George. Nobody answered. Because no words could undo that kind of betrayal. This time, what rose up inside me wasn't fear. I knew fear. I had lived in it for months. This was something entirely different. A cold, sharp anger that left a metallic taste in the back of my throat. I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the floor. George. I walked straight to the window, needing something harmless for my hands to do before they tried to grab someone by the neck. I stood there for a full minute, taking deep breaths, staring out at the motionless lawn in Emery's yard. When I walked back to the table, my mind was made up. I'm calling Arthur. Eleanor, I strongly advise waiting, Sarah urged. We don't know how much he knows. George. If we reveal our hand now, he's still living in that house with them. He watches Derek drive a truck stolen in my name every single day, I said through gritted teeth. I want to hear him lie to me. The second he speaks, I'll know. Emery didn't push me either way. He just watched me quietly, as he had most of the week, letting me make my own call, even if I could feel he didn't entirely agree. George. Sarah let out a slow breath. Please be careful with what you say. Do not mention any documents, and under no circumstances give away your location. Before I could lose my nerve, I dialed the number. It rang twice before he picked up. Arthur's voice came through in that overly light, careful tone he'd been using lately. Eleanor, you've had us worried sick. George. Did you know Derek transferred my truck into his name? I cut straight to the point. A pause. It was only a fraction of a second longer than normal. I didn't, honey. I don't get involved in how the kids handle their business. You know that's not my place. It was my truck, Arthur. Eleanor, I'm sure there's a misunderstanding here. Derek wouldn't just what? Silence again. George. I could hear him breathing. I could hear him struggling on the other end of the line, weighing his words. Can you just come home? He said. We can sit down as a family and talk this through. Whatever happened, we can fix it. You don't need to be running around with lawyers. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. Who told you I had a lawyer? To that, he said nothing at all. George. Rachel placed her phone in the center of the table, hit speaker and dialed a number. Her expression was completely blank. Sarah sat nearby, legal pad open, pen ready. It rang 3 times before someone picked up. A man's voice came through, sounding relaxed and easygoing. Sanders Notary Services, this is Gary. Mr. Arch. Sanders, I'm following up on a document you notarized back in April, Rachel said, her tone flat and routine. A general power of attorney for Eleanor Vance. Oh, sure, of course. I remember that one, he answered a little too quickly. For a man who notarizes dozens of documents a week, his memory was suspiciously sharp. Nice older lady. Signed right here in my office. No issues at all. Arch. You remember her clearly? Of course. An older woman, very polite. I even remember she wore a blue dress that day. Sat right across from me. Hearing the lie roll out so effortlessly made my stomach churn. How could he invent an entire memory out of thin air so casually? What time was that? Roughly, Rachel continued, keeping her tone light and unhurried. In the afternoon, I think. Arch. Around 2:00 or 2:30. Was anyone else in the room? Nope, just her. Very straightforward signing. Rachel glanced at Sarah, who was already flipping through the file in front of her. In that folder, right beneath the forensic nurse's report from 3 weeks later, was an emergency room record Sarah had pulled without me even knowing. Arch. The date on that ER visit was the exact same day Gary Sanders had just vividly described from memory. Time, 2:11 p.m. Location, not his notary office, but Atlanta Memorial Hospital, 40 minutes away, where I was sitting in a paper gown getting checked for broken ribs. Mr. Sanders, Sarah said, leaning toward the phone. Could you check your log for that date? Arch. Because our client has medical records proving she was at Memorial Hospital that afternoon, not in your office. The silence on the line stretched out indefinitely. When he finally spoke again, the easy tone was completely gone. I'd have to look at my files. Sometimes dates get, mixed up. Take your time, Sarah said, her voice like a velvet hammer. He didn't take his time. Arch. He muttered something vague about needing to check with his staff, and hung up before anyone could stop him. The room went dead silent. I sat without moving. Something heavy settled in my chest. Heavier than anger, colder than fear. He doesn't even know me, I said softly. He fabricated an entire memory for a woman who was never in that room. For what? A small notary fee? A favor for Chloe? Arch. Why he did it doesn't matter, Sarah said firmly. What matters is that his own recorded statement directly contradicts your medical records. That's enough to pursue charges for notary fraud. Convicting a notary I've never met won't touch Derek, I said. And it won't touch Arthur. Emery hadn't said much the whole time. Arch. He sat with his arms crossed, staring at the phone like it might ring again on its own. It's not enough, he said quietly. I don't want a paperwork violation against a stranger. I want something that reaches through the front door of that house. Something that pulls them into accountability, too. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then closed the folder. Arch. Then that's how we build the case, she said. Step by step, completely airtight. I didn't see what happened at that house in Atlanta with my own eyes. I only put it together later through what Emery told me, like waking up with a bruise and figuring out how you got it by pressing on the sore spot. For the first 2 days, Arthur kept calling Emery. Arch. At first, it was mundane stuff, questions about tax forms or house bills. Emery shut down those probes with short, cool answers. By Thursday, the tone of the calls changed. Emery could tell Derek was standing right behind his father, feeding him lines word for word. Arch. Emery told me that by the 4th call, Arthur sounded like a completely different person. Smaller, cornered, mechanically repeating phrases that weren't his own. Are you really going to let an uncle who hasn't been around in 12 years make decisions for this family? Arthur demanded over the phone. Arch. Emery said he could clearly hear Derek's low voice in the background, hovering close to the receiver, pushing his father step by step. 4 days after sending Arthur that first text confirming I was safe, I sent a second one. I didn't think much of it at the time. Arch. It was just a casual comment about how quiet my surroundings were, and how if you cracked the window in the morning, you could hear the blue herons down by Lake Oconee and the wind through the pines. When I typed those words, I didn't think there was any danger in them. I was thinking about nature, not geography or neighborhood details. But Arthur took those words to heart. Ouch. Emery told me that when Derek kept pushing Arthur at home, demanding to know if any old friends, veterans, or business partners owned property outside Atlanta near a lake, Arthur didn't mean to give me away. He just fell into a specific kind of silence. It was the silence of a man caught off guard by the truth, lacking the spine to lie convincingly. Ouch. Derek caught that silence instantly and acted on it. He didn't need an exact street number. He just needed to be pointed toward the right highway leading to Lake Oconee, driving slowly past private properties with wrought iron gates until a house matching the description came into view. Ouch. Emery told me that after Derek left, Arthur called him with a shaking voice to warn him that it might be too late. Arthur insisted he hadn't meant to reveal anything, but that Derek kept pressing and pressing until the location slipped out through his hesitant reactions. It wasn't even a direct answer. Just a silence Derek read perfectly. I believed it. Ouch. That was classic Arthur. Never telling a direct lie, but never standing his ground either. In every moment that mattered, he was as weak as water. When I heard the car engine, I was standing in the kitchen. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway was slow and deliberate. Not the sound of someone lost and looking for directions. Ouch. Before my brain could even process why, my whole body went rigid. I set my mug down hard on the marble counter, spilling coffee onto my fingers, but I didn't even feel the heat. Through the kitchen blinds, I saw the dark blue Chevy pickup rolling slowly down the long driveway. It was an unfamiliar truck, dark and heavy, moving with an unmistakable confidence. Ouch. The driver knew exactly where he was going. My chest squeezed tight, a feeling I knew all too well. I thought I had left it behind when I walked out of that house. That deep-rooted fear came rushing back so fast, it shocked me more than the sight of the truck itself. Ouch. It was a harsh reminder that a year of walking on eggshells doesn't vanish from your muscle memory just because you change your zip code. Emery? I called out, my voice trembling. Someone's here. Before the truck even came to a complete stop, Emery was already walking toward the front door. His pace was steady, a calm that made my racing heart feel both foolish and anchored. Ouch. He glanced back at me once. Stay away from the window, he said smoothly. I'll handle this. Every instinct left in my body screamed at me to step out there, to smooth things over, to keep the peace, just like I had done 100 times before with minor family arguments. I wanted to say something weak enough to keep anyone from losing their temper. Ouch. If this had been a year ago, I would have already been out on that porch, apologizing softly for a mistake I didn't even make. But not this time. I pressed myself flat against the wall beside the kitchen window, close enough to hear everything outside but hidden from view. I forced myself to stand completely still, palms flat against the cool plaster wall, holding myself up. Ouch. The first voice I heard was Derek's. On that quiet lakeside driveway, his voice was far too loud, dripping with annoyance before a single word had even been exchanged. I know she's in there. I just want to talk to her. She's not accepting visitors, Emery said, his tone flat and unbothered, completely untouched by Derek's aggression. This is none of your business, Emery. Ouch. This is a private family matter. It became my business the day you left bruises on my sister's wrist. A sharp silence hung in the air. When Derek spoke again, his tone shifted. The arrogant anger thinned out, replaced by something closer to desperation. Look, I don't want to make a big deal out of this. I just need her to finish signing the papers she already agreed to. Ouch. This needs to be settled today. Hearing that word sent a chill straight through me. Not talk. Not check if she's okay. Settled. Like I was just a loose thread on a form that needed to be clipped, not a human being he had hurt. And the sad part was, A small, weak part of me still felt the urge to step outside just to make it easier for him to say what he came to say. Orch. She's not signing anything today, Emery said. Or tomorrow. She won't be signing a single thing without her lawyer present. A lawyer? Derek repeated the word, letting out a short, bitter laugh. You've had her for 1 week, and you've already turned her against her own family. You're not welcome here, Emery said coldly. In that instant, something in his voice hardened. Orch. He didn't raise his voice, but it carried a finality that shut down any debate before it could even start. If you have anything to say to her, say it through her attorney. If you step foot on this property again, it won't be a family matter. It'll be a police matter. The silence that followed stretched out longer than it actually was. Orch. I heard boots shifting on the gravel, then the roar of the engine starting up. The truck backed away slowly, slower than it had arrived, as if Derek was trying to prove he wasn't backing down, just choosing to leave. A few minutes later, Emery walked back inside. He checked on me with a quick glance, not forcing me to talk about what just happened right away. Orch. He picked up his phone and called Sarah, giving her a brief summary in a low voice. Derek knew the address, and he had explicitly mentioned needing to get things settled. I sat at the kitchen table, listening to his side of the call. Now that the truck was gone, my hands were finally steady. We need to file an emergency motion, Emery told Sarah. Tonight, if possible. Orch. I'm not going to sit here and wait to see what he tries next. After hanging up, he looked at me with that same careful, assessing eyes he had on the porch that very first day, checking to see if I was about to break. Sarah's filing for an emergency protective order first thing tomorrow, he said. Ex-party. Orch. With the evidence of notary fraud and your medical records already in the file, she's confident the judge will grant it the same day. I nodded. For the first time since coming to this house, the floor beneath my feet felt solid, no longer tilting to throw me off balance. Just as Sarah predicted, the judge signed the protective order the next morning, faster than even she expected. Orch. With a formal notary fraud complaint and detailed medical records backing the petition, the emergency order went through smoothly. By noon, the court papers were served to Derek. By law, he was forbidden from coming within 500 feet of me or the house. That should have felt like a win. But it didn't. Orch. A piece of paper doesn't undo what he took, I said, watching Sarah lay out file after file across the table like a deck of cards. It doesn't fix the truck title he stole, and it doesn't touch whatever else Rachel hasn't dug up yet. You're right, Sarah agreed. A protective order just gives us breathing room, that's all. So what actually ends this? I asked. Orch. She didn't try to sugarcoat the reality. We need more contradictions, just like the ones that broke that notary. Right now, we have strong suspicions, one forged document, and a witness who backed himself into a corner on a timeline. Getting a full confession would be nice, but we don't actually need them breaking down in tears. Orch. What we need is for them to drop their guard, talk freely, and keep talking until what comes out of their mouths no longer matches the paper trail. That is the evidence that holds up. Sarah leaned forward slightly. It's not about a dramatic moment. It's about enough cracks in their story that a jury stops believing a single word they say. Orch. They aren't just going to hand us those cracks, I said. Of course not, Sarah replied. But when people sit in a room thinking they've already won, they get comfortable. And comfortable people stop being careful. That's the vulnerability we use. She laid out the plan in plain, direct terms. A meeting back at that house in Atlanta, led by me. Only this time, I set the rules. Orch. I would tell them I was ready to finalize the house deed. Ready to update my will, just like they had been pushing me to do for months. In that room, the relief of getting what they wanted would loosen their tongues. My phone would be recording, placed somewhere out of sight. Under Georgia law, as long as one person in the conversation consents to being recorded, it is completely legal. Orch. And that one person would be me. You want me to go back into that house and lie to their faces? I asked. I want you to ask questions. Sarah corrected me. Questions you already know the answers to. Watch where their story drifts away from the evidence we already have. That's the whole strategy. Don't force a confession. Orch. Just capture enough inconsistencies on tape so they have nowhere to hide in court. I sat in silence for a long time, my hands resting flat on the table. My chest tightened again, but it wasn't fear this time. What if I can't keep my face straight? I asked softly, my voice thinner than I wanted. What if I look at Derek and everything I'm feeling just spills out and gives me away? Orch. Nobody rushed to comfort me. Sitting across the table, Emery just watched me, keeping the room honest instead of offering fake reassurance. Then we don't do it, Sarah said simply. This plan only works if you can handle it. I will not put you in that room to play a role you aren't ready for. Oddly enough, those words were what grounded me. Orch. It wasn't a false promise that everything would be easy. It was the explicit permission to say no. And as I searched inside myself, underneath all the leftover fear, I found something I didn't realize was there yet. I wanted to do it. I'll ask the questions, I said, raising my eyes, but I decide when it stops. If things go wrong, I pull the plug. Not you, and not Emery. Orch. Sarah gave a slow nod, as if she had been waiting for me to say that all along. Emery didn't say a word, but his shoulders visibly eased up. That told me he had been waiting for this moment too. We go back next week, I announced, and this time it's on my terms. Once the decision was made, a quiet settled over the kitchen. A good quiet. Orch. The kind of confident silence that only comes after making up your mind. The house in that upscale Atlanta neighborhood smelled exactly the same. It surprised me, though it shouldn't have. Lemon furniture polish mixed with the faint trace of Chloe's Jo Malone perfume, layered over years of my own cooking that still lingered in the walls. Orch. I paused at the front door for a second, letting my body remember how to walk through without flinching. I mentally noted what had changed in the week I was gone. A different Pottery Barn throw pillow on the living room sofa. My favorite reading chair pushed slightly out of place. Small details declaring that life in this house had kept right on, going without me. Chloe was the first to rush over. Orch. She opened her arms, her voice stepping up to the softest tone I had ever heard her use. Eleanor, thank God. We were worried sick. I let her wrap her arms around me. I forced my body to go soft in her hug, just like I used to do without thinking. The lie felt like an old coat I hadn't worn in a while, but I still remembered where every single button went. Orch. It almost scared me how easily that old performance of compliance came back, as if my body had never stopped rehearsing it. I'm sorry for frightening everyone, I said gently. I just needed some quiet time. Derek lingered by the kitchen doorway, with his arms crossed. He tried to put on a face of concern, but it just came off as relief. Orch. Technically, that protective order kept him from coming near me outside. But inside this house, where I had walked back involuntarily, those restrictions were useless, and he knew it. You look good, he said. Coming from someone who had left me covered in bruises, that casual line was so absurd I had to look down at the dining table to keep my face from reacting. Arthur wasn't there yet. Orch. Chloe brushed it off smoothly, saying he was running an errand and would be late. The way she glided over it made it obvious it wasn't just a simple errand. I took my usual seat, resting my hands neatly in my lap, just like Sarah and I had rehearsed. I let the silence hang for a beat before speaking up. I've been thinking a lot lately, I said. Orch. About this house, and about what you two have been asking me to do. Chloe's whole posture changed. I watched her shoulders drop half an inch, the tension in her face melting away completely. I want to finalize the house deed, I continued. And I think it's time to properly update my will, too. Just to make sure everything is settled the way it should be. Orch. That word, settled, felt heavy in my mouth, borrowed straight from the cold tone Derek had used on the porch. I watched his face to see if he noticed. He didn't. He was too busy exchanging a look with Chloe. An unspoken current passed between them. They didn't even bother hiding it anymore. Because now that I was handing over the prize they had been waiting for, why would they? Orch. That's wonderful, Chloe said. For a second, her relief almost looked like real warmth. But that was the part that cut the deepest, far deeper than any physical pain. She had always been capable of showing kindness. She had just calculated that, unless there was something in it for her, I wasn't worth a shred of her effort. Torch. I kept my hands steady in my lap, refusing to let that harsh realization show on my face. I want everyone here when we do it, I suggested calmly. You, Derek, and Arthur. I want to handle the paperwork properly in front of all of you, so there are no misunderstandings down the road. Torch. Name the time and we'll be here, Derek said, already pulling out his phone to check his calendar, his mind racing, to figure out how fast we could close this out. Let's do Thursday afternoon, I said. Right here. Chloe nodded, a smile spreading across her face. It was the first time I had ever seen her look completely unguarded. Torch. On Thursday afternoon, before anyone else sat down, I placed my phone on the dining table. Screen down, angled slightly toward the center, just enough to catch every voice in the room. I told myself it was just to keep my hands free, though nobody needed convincing. My hands were shaking so badly, I couldn't hold a piece of paper anyway. At least that part required no acting. Torch. Arthur was the last to arrive. He slid into his chair without making eye contact. His tie was slightly crooked, telling me he had either rushed out the door or was completely out of it. Coffee, everyone? Chloe offered brightly, her tone entirely too cheerful. Before anyone could answer, she picked up the pot. This feels like a nice family gathering. Nobody pointed out the act. Torch. I let the small talk run its course. Comments about the weather, the neighbor's new fence, Derek complaining about gas prices as if this were just any normal Thursday. I used the time to watch, just like Sarah had coached me. Observe first. Let them get comfortable. I brought the paperwork, Chloe finally said, sliding a folder across the table. Torch. Before we get to that, I said, keeping my voice slow and even, I want to clear a few things up. When did we first start talking about this property transfer? Chloe blinked, caught off guard by the direct question. Back in the spring, I think, around March. March, I repeated, letting the words settle in the air. That's interesting. I don't recall us sitting down to discuss this in March. Torch. We didn't need a big sit-down, she replied quickly. You already agreed back then, remember? Right before you had that fall in the kitchen. I hadn't agreed to anything in March. I spent most of March at Atlanta Memorial Hospital. That was the very week a notary I had never met swore I was sitting across from his desk in a blue dress. Torch. Before I could press further, Chloe's eyes drifted down to the table, landing on my phone lying screen down next to my coffee cup. Is that thing recording? She asked with a forced laugh, reaching her hand out. It's a little rude to leave a phone out during a family conversation. My chest seized. Before her fingers could touch it, I placed my hand over the phone. Torch. I moved smoothly, without rushing, the way you would cover an ordinary object rather than crucial evidence. I'm waiting for a call, I said. From the clinic, regarding the follow-up report on my ribs. I let a touch of real pain show on my face. It wasn't entirely an act. They said they'd call with the results today. I don't want to miss it. Chloe pulled her hand back. Torch. At the mention of my ribs, her mouth twitched. That reminder sitting between us pointed straight to how those ribs had actually been broken. She looked away first. Of course, she stammered. Sorry. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He looked at his father, but Arthur was staring intently at the folder, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Torch. Arthur's jaw worked as if he wanted to say something, but he swallowed it back down. I let the silence hang for a moment before turning my attention back to Chloe. My voice stayed steady, and my hands finally stopped shaking in my lap. So, tell me more about March. I pushed gently. Because I remember clearly where I was that week, and I certainly wasn't sitting at my kitchen table. Torch. Chloe opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, frantically searching for a story about March that could hold up. But no excuse made sense. Maybe I got the exact date mixed up, she brushed off. It doesn't matter, it was around then. The point is, you agreed to it. I never agreed to anything I didn't see on paper first, I said quietly, almost peacefully. Orch, you told me it was just a formality. You put the pen in my hand and told me to hurry up and sign. That's not what happened, Chloe snapped, a flush creeping up her neck. Derek leaned forward, his jaw tight. He watched the exchange like a builder watching a wall he built start to crack. Can we stop dragging this out? He said, exasperated. She said she was ready to sign, right? Orch, what difference does it make how we got here? Because I need to understand how we got here, I said. I let the silence after that statement hold for as long as it needed. I watched Derek like watching a pot, is about to boil over. Slam. Derek brought his palm down hard on the table. It wasn't full force, but it was sharp enough to make the coffee cups rattle against their saucers. Orch. Because it didn't happen the way you're making it sound. You didn't look at the papers that day because you were throwing a fit over nothing, and I needed to get it done. Simple as that. Needed to get what done? I asked, still soft, still patient. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My folded hands the only thing keeping me together. Orch. You think I wanted to handle it that way? Derek's voice cracked as he yelled, the words spilling out too fast for him to stop. If you had just signed the papers the first time I asked, none of this would have happened. I wouldn't had to. He cut himself off sharply. He ran a hand through his hair, then tried to restart, as if trying to pull back the words that had already escaped. Orch. Dad knew everything, okay? Derek nearly roared. He looked at that second page before it ever left this house. Don't sit there playing the innocent victim like this is some massive shock to him. Dead silence swallowed the room. The low hum of the refrigerator echoed from the kitchen, a sound I had never noticed in the 20 years I lived here. Orch, now it sounded deafening, filling the terrible void left by Derek's words. It felt like the whole house was holding its breath with us. Arthur's face drained to an ashen gray. He didn't defend himself. He didn't defend his son. He just sat there staring at the table, looking like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. Orch. His hands gripped his knees tightly, as if holding on to something solid was all that kept him from falling. Chloe glared at Derek, her eyes sharp with pure rage. It was the look of an accomplice watching her partner hand over the exact secret she had spent months trying to cover up. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let my face betray the storm crashing inside me. Orch. It was a feeling close to relief mixed with a deep, heavy sadness I couldn't quite name, and beneath both was a complete, quiet clarity I had never felt in this house before. Thank you for telling me, I said. I meant it. It was the strange gratitude you feel when someone finally shows you their true, unfiltered self. Orch. Derek's expression shifted as his brain finally caught up to the fatal mistake his mouth had just made. His eyes darted down to the phone on the table. It was still screen down, resting quietly right where I had left it. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. And then, 3 firm, loud knocks rattled the front door. Emery answered it. Orch. I heard the low voices before I saw them. A man and a woman in plain clothes, carrying an effortless authority that didn't need a uniform to announce itself. I'm Detective Aldridge, the female officer said as she stepped across the threshold into the dining room, her partner half a step behind her. We're following up on an open file related to this address. Orch. Given the protective order on record and the formal complaint regarding notary fraud, we needed to conduct a routine check today. Nobody had tipped them off about what they would walk into. It wasn't luck. It was standard police work catching up to a case that had been building over the last 2 weeks. And this time, the process arrived at the exact right moment. Orch. Derek bolted up, moving so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. This is a private family matter. I don't know what you think is going on here, but, sir, I need you to take your seat, the partner said calmly, completely unbothered by Derek's outburst. I didn't do anything, Derek insisted, his voice dropping as if trying to convince himself. I didn't do anything wrong. Orch. Chloe didn't raise her voice at all. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap in the exact same pose I had used moments earlier. She asked a single measured question. "Am I free to decline answering questions without my attorney present?" "Yes, ma'am," Detective Aldridge replied. "You have the right to remain silent." Chloe didn't say another word. She just scanned the room with the same cold, calculating eyes she had carried all afternoon. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating which version of silence would cost her the least. She glanced at Derek only once. A look that made it clear she was already cutting him loose legally, no matter what stupid thing he said next. The first person to crack was Arthur. "Wait," he said, his voice breaking on the single word. Every eye in the room turned to him. "Wait. I need to say something." The detective paused, pulling out a notepad. "I didn't write that second page." Arthur started, each word coming out slower than the last, like dragging something heavy out of a wreck. "But I saw it. Derek showed it to me before it was sent out for notarization. I knew what it was. But I told myself it was paperwork between him and his stepmother, and I shouldn't interfere." His eyes finally lifted to meet mine, wet and looking older than I had ever seen them. "I knew about it, Eleanor. I didn't do anything, but I always knew." Detective Aldridge jotted something down, then looked straight at him. "Sir, that will be documented as a voluntary statement." "Voluntary admissions carry weight with the DA's office. I can't make any promises, but it matters." She turned to her partner. "Between the file we already have and what was said right as we walked in, we have more than enough to proceed today." Nobody spoke after that. Derek's face completely fell into a mix of feeling betrayed and total disbelief. He stared at his father as if looking at a stranger wearing his father's face. I didn't feel a surge of victory. In the quiet nights in Emery's guest room, I had imagined this moment might feel like winning a battle. But it didn't. It just felt like standing at the edge of something finally coming to an end, realizing the ground on the other side was just as unfamiliar as where I had been standing. The only difference was that it was quiet now. This space was mine again. They handcuffed Derek and Chloe first and led them out, passing through the porch where Emery had first noticed the bruises on my wrist. Neighbors in our neat suburban neighborhood were already gathering at the edges of their lawns, pretending not to look while taking in every single detail. I stood on my porch without turning away or smiling. I just felt something inside my chest, finally quietly settle into place. 6 weeks have passed since I stood on that porch watching them get driven away. I've settled into a peace I hadn't felt in over a year. I don't check the door locks out of fear first thing in the morning, and I don't strain my ears for the sound of tires on the gravel in the evening. I moved back into the house and back into my own bed. But I completely rearranged the furniture, so it doesn't feel like the same room anymore. On a Tuesday afternoon, Sarah called. Her voice had that sharp, professional tone she uses when she has news to deliver straight. "We found something new during financial discovery," she said. "When prosecutors subpoenaed Chloe's account records, the insurance company turned over documents showing she changed the beneficiary on a life insurance policy 8 months ago. It was Arthur's policy." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the very table where all these pieces had first started falling apart. "Arthur's policy?" I repeated. "Not the house, and not mine?" "Technically, it used to be yours," Sarah explained. "For over 10 years, you were listed as the sole beneficiary, but 8 months ago that changed. Chloe's name completely replaced yours." She paused, letting the information sink in. She used the same altered power of attorney form Rachel discovered early on. "The second page attached to your medical authorization. If the wording on a POA is broad enough, insurance companies will accept notarized forms to update beneficiaries. And the wording on that extra page was drafted to cover it." It was a second layer of damage from the exact same forged document months down the line. I digested the news quietly, without rushing to feel anything about it. A year ago, a discovery like that would have completely undone me. But now it landed differently. It felt more like confirmation of something I had already sensed. Back when Chloe offered me that sweet, convincing smile in this very kitchen, I had finally realized something. She was fully capable of warmth, she just put a price tag on it. So she wasn't just doing this for Derek, I said. She was setting up her own track on the side. It does complicate the case a bit, Sarah explained. It means prosecutors will likely add a separate fraud charge for the policy alongside the financial exploitation charges regarding you. It also means Chloe's defense attorney might try to separate her actions from Derek's, arguing she was pursuing something entirely different and shouldn't be lumped into the direct harm done to you. Will that work? Not with the recording we have, and not when both charges rely on the exact same forged document, Sarah said confidently. But it will stretch the legal process out longer than we anticipated. I thanked her, and we covered a few more details about upcoming deposition dates and trial prep months away. When the call ended, I sat alone at the table once more. I turned the news over in my head, but it couldn't cut deep like it used to. I thought briefly about the countless meals I had cooked in this kitchen for people who sat at this table calculating what else they could take from me. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It just felt real. The cold, hard truth of things when you stop needing facts to be gentle. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Arthur. The first one since everything happened. Can we talk in person? Whenever you're ready. No pressure. I stared at the message for a long time. I couldn't tell if the request was a closure he owed me, or just another thing he needed from me to make himself feel better. I didn't reply right away. I eventually agreed to meet Arthur, choosing the conference room at Sarah's law firm. Neutral ground. A cold meeting table instead of the kitchen where we had spent 20 years eating meals and swallowing arguments. When I arrived, he was already seated, hands folded on the table just as mine had been the day I confronted Derek and Chloe. Only his hands hadn't learned to stay still like mine had. I've been trying to figure out what to say. He broke the silence. But every time I rehearse it, it just sounds like an excuse. Then don't give me excuses, I said. Give me the truth. He went quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, he paced his words slowly, as if finally giving up on rehearsed lines. I told myself every day that it wasn't that bad. I used that lie to numb myself. But I knew. I saw the bruises on your wrist, just like Emery did. Since you said you were fine, I chose to believe you. Because if I believed your words, I didn't have to face it. I didn't have to do anything. That's the first real thing you've said to me in a year, I replied flatly. No anger, just stating the fact. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, he said. I don't think I have the right to ask for that. No, I said, you don't. He nodded, looking like he'd been expecting that answer all along. In a way, he almost seemed relieved that I didn't try to wrap things up in polite, comforting lies. I gave him nothing beyond the bare truth he'd just handed me. 20 years of marriage don't just disappear in a single conversation, but I had no intention of pretending they could be erased, no matter how quiet or humble his tone was. The divorce went through quickly, uncontested. Just like Sarah promised, as long as we weren't fighting over assets, it was mostly a matter of pushing paperwork. Arthur didn't ask for the house. I don't think he had the spirit left in him to ask me for anything, and I certainly wasn't going to offer. Sometime the following week, I stood alone in the study Chloe used to occupy. She used to spread her color-coded folders all across my desk. I popped open a can of paint I had bought that morning, a warm, soft shade this house had never seen before. I decided to start with the door. Long, even brush strokes, slowly covering up the faded, yellowing white that had been there long before any of this happened. I wasn't trying to be overly symbolic. It was just a door that needed a fresh coat. And for the first time, I was the only person with the power to decide what color it was going to be. Late that afternoon, Emery came by. He walked right in through the back door without knocking, a new habit he'd picked up lately. He found me in the study, my hands flecked with paint. The last light of the afternoon sun fell through the window, catching the wet sheen on the newly painted door. "You look tired," he said. "I am," I replied. "It's a good kind of tired, though." Torch. He didn't hover with that cautious, watchful guard he had a month ago. He just leaned against the doorframe for a moment, taking in the fresh coat of paint, the rearranged room, and the version of me standing there. Someone who didn't exist back when he pulled back my sleeve on the porch. "You good?" he asked. "I'm good," I said. Torch. For the first time in longer than I could count, I heard myself say those words and knew in my bones that they were true. It wasn't a closed door meant to keep everyone out. It was just a simple, solid fact. I set my paintbrush down, looked at the finished door, and let the house fall completely quiet around me. For 11 years, I sat in this house without ever raising my voice. Torch. For 11 years, at a dining table covered in a lace runner, I learned to swallow my words. I learned to smile when there was nothing to smile about, because in a wealthy southern suburb like Oak Creek County, Georgia, that's what you do when your daughter marries into an old money family built on decency and quiet. On that Sunday, that quiet shattered completely. Torch. My name is Eleanor Vance, and until that afternoon, I thought I fully understood the family my daughter had married into. My daughter Chloe was 8 months pregnant. Her feet were so swollen her ankles had disappeared, and she was resting them on a leather ottoman. That's when her sister-in-law, Harper, walked in from the kitchen, holding an open MacBook. Torch. She slammed it right down onto my daughter's lap. It was the third weekend in a row. Invoices from high-end dinner vendors that needed checking before Sunday dinner. As if Chloe wasn't heavily pregnant, as if she didn't even deserve the right to sit quietly on a Sunday. Chloe looked up at her and said she was tired. Her voice was soft, without a hint of an argument. Torch. No sharp emotion, just pure exhaustion. Harper's hand came up so fast I instinctively thought she was going to slap her, and I braced myself to step in front of my daughter. It wasn't a slap. It was a clenched fist coming down hard and direct, right into the curve of my daughter's swollen belly. Chloe folded over in pain. Torch. The laptop smashed against the imported tile, the screen shattering with a sharp crack in the quiet living room. And Vivian, the matriarch of the family, the woman I had baked pecan pies for every Thanksgiving for a decade, the woman who cried at Chloe's wedding and called her a daughter, stood straight up from her leather recliner. "Do it again," she said coldly. She brought it on herself. Torch. I spun around to look at Preston, my son-in-law, the man who had sworn before 200 guests on a country club lawn to protect my daughter. He was less than 3 feet away from Chloe. His feet didn't move an inch, his lips didn't part, he didn't even call out his wife's name. In that fraction of a second, something inside me turned ice cold and crystal clear. Torch. Because I looked around the room and not a single one of them looked shocked. Harper had already lowered her arm, looking as natural as if she'd just folded a fresh towel. Vivian's face had smoothed back out, carrying the quiet satisfaction of a plan carried out perfectly. This wasn't new to any of them. This was a room long accustomed to staying quiet through cruelty. Torch. I don't remember getting up. I only remember the sharp crack of my hand slapping Preston's right cheek. Once, and then before he could pull back again. The sound was louder than anything anyone had said since I walked through that door. He covered his face with both hands, looking at me in utter disbelief, as if I were the one who had done something wrong in that house. Torch. I stepped in close, keeping my voice low enough that only the 4 of them could hear. "I will make you answer for every single mark you left on her if it's the last thing I do." Nobody moved. Harper's mouth was still half open, her words caught in her throat. Vivian's hand was still half raised from giving orders. Torch. Preston stood there covering his face, looking like it was the first time in his life anyone had ever held him accountable. And Chloe, my Chloe, was still curled up on that ottoman. one hand pressed flat against her stomach, staring at the three of them like she was seeing who they really were for the very first time. The room went dead quiet. My hand was still stinging. Hours later, I sat on the plastic waiting room chairs at Oak Creek County General Hospital. The sound of my hand striking his face kept replaying in my head, as if my body needed to relive it just to believe I'd actually done it. They rushed Chloe into the ER within minutes. I was held back behind the double doors, left sitting there clutching my purse, her blood pressure numbers from the triage nurse still ringing in my ears. Too high, too fast. It was no false alarm. Nearly an hour later, a doctor walked out. He introduced himself as Dr. Miller and told me that Chloe and the baby were stable for now. But his tone carried that careful, measured pace American doctors use right before delivering bad news. He told me he had documented bruising across Chloe's lower abdomen, consistent with direct, blunt force. He noted the timeline Chloe provided. Then he looked at me carefully and said that when he asked if anything like this had happened before, Chloe fell silent and refused to answer. I asked him what that meant. He didn't answer directly, just held my gaze for a second longer. That silence was the answer. He informed me that a county deputy would be coming by shortly to take a report. 20 minutes later, a young deputy arrived, notebook out, asking me to recount what happened. I told him everything. Harper's name, Vivian's words, and how Preston stood there like a stone post doing nothing. His pen moved steadily across the paper, until I mentioned the name Sterling. His pen stopped midward, hovering over the page as if his hand had suddenly forgotten how to write. Sterling? He repeated, not even as a real question. Yes. The home of Mrs. Vivian Sterling. Her daughter Harper, her son Preston. He wrote a little more, but his pace slowed down, his notes getting noticeably sparser. It looked like he was editing as he wrote. I didn't fully realize what I was watching back then, but I knew one thing. A police officer's pen doesn't freeze over an address unless that address already carries weight. He asked a few routine questions, thanked me, said someone would follow up, and left. I walked back into Chloe's quiet room. They had finally let me in. I held her hand while she stared blankly at the ceiling, not saying a single word about what had happened. I wish I could say I felt relief after the police took the report, but I didn't. What I felt was something narrower and far more terrifying than fear. It felt like a door you thought was standing, wide open, had been quietly locked behind your back. 2 days later, the sheriff's office called. A woman's voice on the line. Flat, mechanical, like she was reading from a script. She told me the incident had been reviewed and classified as a domestic dispute. Since Chloe was unwilling to provide a formal statement, and there were no independent witnesses outside the family, they determined there wasn't enough evidence to move forward. No criminal charges are recommended at this time, she said. The case will remain open should further evidence be submitted. I asked her to repeat that sentence. She read it word for word again, like reading from a cue card. Long after the line went dead, I stood in my spacious kitchen, holding the phone to my ear and staring at the island. I thought back to the officer's pen freezing at that name, and for the first time, I truly understood that what happened in that living room wasn't just between me and those 4 people. It was me against a system far larger than I knew how to name. That Wednesday, I went back to the hospital just to sign some discharge paperwork we'd missed the first time. I wasn't looking for anything, but a nurse named Lorelei caught me in the hallway, looking like she'd been waiting for me. She didn't sit down. Her voice was low and strictly professional, the kind of quiet that tells you someone is choosing every word with absolute care. She told me that due to HIPAA regulations, she couldn't directly discuss another patient's medical history with me. Not directly, not in those words. But as she spoke, her eyes stayed locked on mine, steady and unwavering, as if the subtext mattered 100 times more than the actual words coming out of her mouth. You're her mother. You're listed as her emergency contact and care advocate. she said. That means you have the right to formally request her past emergency room records yourself. She paused. Orch. If I were you, I'd do that sooner rather than later. That was all. No names, no dates, nothing she wasn't allowed to say. But the look in her eyes told me she wasn't offering advice. She was handing me a key, telling me to open the door myself before someone welded it shut for good. I thanked her. She gave a single nod and walked away, acting as if the conversation had never taken place. Orch. I didn't waste a second. I drove straight to Chloe and Preston's house, my heart racing faster than it had any right to for someone just picking up paperwork. I sat at the expensive walnut dining table Preston had picked out, looked at Chloe, and asked her point blank, "Had this happened before?" Orch. She froze instantly. The same tell she'd had since she was a little girl whenever she was bracing to tell a lie. "Mom, don't ask." "Chloe, has it?" "It's not what you think, Mom. I'm not assuming anything. I'm asking you." She stood up, walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, and started rinsing a glass that was already clean. Orch. For a long time, the only sound in the kitchen was the rush of water against stainless steel. Then she turned off the faucet, stood with her back to me, and pressed both palms flat against the marble counter to steady herself. Usually, it wasn't like this. It was small things. Orch. A rough yank on my arm, or a door slammed right next to me. Her voice cracked in the middle of the sentence and couldn't quite recover. I never told anyone because nobody ever saw it. This was the first time anyone else was there. I didn't say anything right away. I couldn't. Orch. All the anger that had carried me through the hospital corridors and that phone call with the sheriff's office drained away in an instant. What was left underneath was something much heavier, much quieter. Sorrow. Pure sorrow. For every year I had been kept in the dark. For every dinner I sat their table believing my daughter was just tired, or pregnant, or that everything was fine. Orch. I got up, walked over behind her, and laid my hand on her back. She didn't pull away, which spoke louder than anything she could have said. "Pack your bags," I said. "You're coming home with me." She didn't fight me. Orch. 4 days later, with 2 suitcases and a box of baby clothes, without Preston asking about her even once, she moved back into her childhood bedroom, looking like she was 17 again. And this time, I wasn't going to let her suffer in silence in a house I wasn't supposed to protect. I found the box by accident while looking for something else. Orch. It was mostly old photos. Chloe's engagement dinner, her bridal shower, 5 or 6 Thanksgivings, stacked one on top of the other in an old shoebox I hadn't opened in years. I had just tried to grab a picture frame from the shelf above, and the box tumbled down, scattering photos across my kitchen floor. I sat right down on the tile and started going through them. Orch. By the 3rd photo, my hand stopped. There was Vivian at the engagement dinner, her hand resting on Chloe's shoulder, smiling for the camera. But in that picture, the expensive filet mignon in front of Chloe was barely touched. Orch. I remembered now. Vivian had smiled and mentioned that the portions at that upscale restaurant were a bit much for a bride about to fit into a gown. So Chloe had quietly pushed her plate aside. There was another one, from the year after the wedding. Vivian standing behind Chloe, adjusting her collar before anyone took the photo. Orch. Chloe's shoulders were drawn inward. A defensive posture she only ever used as a child when she was caught doing something wrong. At the bottom of the box was a printed nursery mood board. Chloe had shown it to me early in her pregnancy, full of soft pastel yellows she had chosen herself. But I remembered now that the room ended up painted light blue and stark white. Orch. Those were Vivian's choices, because Vivian said yellow was hardly dignified for a sterling heir. For 11 years I had smiled through every single one of those dinners. I used to call it closeness. I used to tell myself Chloe had married into a family that cared about the details. It wasn't care, it was control. Orch. It was wrapped up so elegantly that for 11 years I mistook it for Southern hospitality. That night I called Chloe in and asked her directly, When did Harper start dumping all those vendor invoices and errands on her during family gatherings? The line went silent, just like at the kitchen table that day. Mom, it's really not that big of a deal. Porch. Chloe, has it always been like this with them? A long, heavy pause, and then her voice dropped to a whisper. Since before the wedding. Honestly, since we got engaged, 6 years. Not the 6 weeks I had assumed. This didn't start with the pregnancy, and it hadn't just escalated recently. Porch. For 6 years, those tiny corrections, minor assignments, and quiet tests had been disguised as family intimacy. And I hadn't seen through a single one. Why didn't you ever say anything? Because it looked like nothing, Mom. Just a napkin folded the wrong way or the wrong tone on the phone. They were so small that if I said them out loud, I would sound like the crazy one. Porch. I sat there in silence for a long time. The photos were still scattered across the floor, every single one showing Vivian's hand resting on my daughter's shoulder, as if claiming a ownership we had never agreed to give. Something inside me turned cold and set firm, a place sorrow could never reach. Sorrow just sits in your chest, but this feeling ran deeper, harder, and far more focused. Porch. I thought about the deputy's pen freezing at their name. I thought about the doctor documenting every detail, and the nurse who handed me a key without saying a word more than she had to. Grit alone wasn't going to be enough. Someone had spent 6 years using undocumented small things to build a cage. Porch. If I was going to fight back, I needed someone who knew how to document things properly. Someone who could turn 6 years of wrongly folded napkins into evidence that holds up in court. I picked up my phone and started searching for family law attorneys, without giving myself a second thought. Porch. Before calling any lawyer, I looked into the catering business myself to see what I was actually dealing with. Sterling Elite Catering. On the company website, Preston's name was prominently listed under Founder on every business card found in Chloe's old drawers. He was smiling right beside his mother. Founder. I stared at the word. Porch. Because founder implies ownership, and the way that word sat next to his photo didn't sit right with me. That afternoon, I pulled the Georgia Business Registry filings. Sole proprietorship. Vivian Sterling. No partners, no LLC documents bearing his name. Porch. For 11 years, he worked his heart out in that kitchen. His face printed on every business card and refrigerated truck, but not a single piece of paper proved he owned a fraction of it. That evening, I brought the printed documents to Chloe, laying them flat on her old bed like evidence, and asked her point blank. Does Preston actually hold any equity in this business? Porch. She shook her head slowly. It's not just the business, Mom, it's everything. She picked at the edge of the paper. His father passed away when he was 26, leaving him an inheritance, life insurance, and a piece of land past the county line. Porch. Vivian told him she'd manage it until he settled down. They've been married 6 years now, and I know that money is still sitting in a trust under her name. His name is on the account, too. She opened it that way for tax reasons, supposedly. But he's never had the password, never signed a single withdrawal slip. It's his on paper, but she controls every dime. Porch. Something shifted in my chest, and it wasn't just anger anymore. A grown man working under someone else's name for 11 years. Married 6 years, with money legally his sitting in an account he couldn't touch a single dollar of without his mother's permission. The man who froze like stone in that living room wasn't just weak. He was a man who knew in his bones the price of disobeying his mother. Porch. Standing in Chloe's old bedroom, I didn't forgive him. I want to be clear about that, but I understood what drove him far better than I expected to. Every expense, Chloe said softly, as if waiting for permission to say it. Every gift he ever got me had to run through her first. I used to think they were just close. It wasn't closeness, Mom. I see that now. Porch. She paused, turning the paper over in her hands, then shared something that made my stomach drop in a whole new way. She told me that 2 years ago, right after the wedding, she tried opening a savings account of her own, a small independent fund just for her and the baby. Nothing huge, just a few $100s a month, quietly set aside. Porch. Less than a week later, Vivian brought it up casually at dinner, as if she'd personally reviewed the bank statement. Chloe swore the bank never called Vivian. But the teller who opened the account also worked part-time at Vivian's catering events and brought it up as idle chat while folding napkins. That was the moment I saw the whole picture. This wasn't a family. It was a network. Porch, and everyone in it, paid or not, seemed to know exactly which side they were on. Before calling anyone else, I reached out to Martha Higgins. Martha had been on the county fundraising committee for nearly 15 years and knew things most people in our church never bothered to ask about. I asked her straight out what she knew about the Sterlings. Porch. She didn't answer right away, and that silence told me plenty before she even said a word. Eleanor, why are you asking? I told her the truth, most of it, anyway. Something had happened, and I needed to know who I was up against. She went quiet again. When she spoke, her voice was low, like she was looking over her shoulder, even though she was alone in her own kitchen. Porch. Eleanor, that family has catered the sheriff's re-election gala for almost 12 years. Vivian handles the mayor's Christmas ball, too. You don't get contracts like that by accident. You get them because everyone who matters knows your name and likes what you put on the table. Literally. What about the sheriff's department? Another pause, even longer this time. Porch. Preston's late father was with the department, deputy chief before he retired. Half the command staff still plays golf with his old friends. They show up to the annual Christmas party every year, standing right beside Vivian. I held the phone, slowly sitting down in a kitchen chair, feeling a heavy piece of the puzzle finally click into place. The deputy's pen freezing at the name. Porch. I hadn't understood it then, but I understood it now. Martha, do you think someone's being paid off to turn a blind eye? No, she answered quickly, eager to clear that up. It's not like that. Nobody's passing cash under the table. Porch. It's simpler. You cater a big official's daughter's wedding. You send high-end gift baskets to the station every Christmas for a decade. You stand next to them smiling in photos at every fundraiser. When a report comes in with that last name on it, nobody needs to tell them to look the other way. They just instinctively assume they know them, that they're the good people. Porch. In a way, that felt colder than hearing someone was taking bribes. A bribe is something you can track, prove, and confront in court. This wasn't a crime. It was influence. Thick as syrup, built up over years like rust on something nobody bothered to clean. I thanked Martha and hung up. I sat in the kitchen for a long time, feeling a new kind of quiet takeover. Porch. Not the sorrow from looking at the photos, nor the cold fury from that slap. This was real, sharp awareness. The kind that makes your stomach drop. Because I realized I wasn't just fighting 4 people in a living room anymore. I was up against a name that had spent over a decade greasing the palms of the right people, without breaking a single law along the way. But it didn't make me pull back. Porch. It sharpened my focus completely. If everyone locally had a soft spot for that name, then I needed someone who had never tasted Vivian Sterling's catering. Someone with no history at her table, no favors owed, and no photos on the wall. I picked up my phone and started searching for attorneys 2 counties over. Someone who wouldn't care about the name Sterling in the slightest. Porch. Her office was small, tucked above a dry cleaner in Fulton County. Nothing fancy, which suited me fine. I sat across from Sarah Kepler, holding the hospital records in my lap like fragile glass. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses without even opening the folder yet. Tell me everything. Take your time and don't skip anything just because you think it doesn't matter. Porch. I told her about the slap, what I said, the police report that went nowhere, and the deputy whose pen froze. She took fast, brief notes, hardly looking up. When I finally finished, she leaned back and went quiet for a moment, organizing it all in her mind. The criminal side stalled out, and I understand why you're furious. You have every right to be, Sarah said calmly. Porch. But listen to me. That's not the only way into this. What else is there? She pulled a legal pad toward her, writing as she spoke. Civil court. A civil lawsuit doesn't require a DA's approval or criminal charges. You can sue Harper for battery. You can sue Vivian for intentional infliction of emotional distress for standing right there ordering her daughter to strike a pregnant woman again. George, this isn't about a police report anymore. It's a civil claim running on its own track. For the first time since that hospital hallway, the tension in my chest eased up. So it doesn't matter what the sheriff's department does. We don't need them at all. She let that sink in for a second before continuing, her tone turning more serious. I won't lie to you, Eleanor. This path is slow. George, civil cases can take months, sometimes over a year. It takes time and it takes money, and depending on how they respond, it can get public. People will talk and people will pick sides. I need you to understand that clearly before we take the next step. I understand, and Chloe will too. George, it's not just my fight. I nodded, then asked the question that had been sitting on the tip of my tongue since I walked in. If we win, what happens financially? She leaned forward. A civil judgment attaches to personal assets. Inherited, saved, whatever is legally theirs. You told me his name is on that trust account alongside his mother's. George. In the eyes of the law, that's his asset, regardless of who holds the password. If Preston is held jointly liable for covering this up, a court judgment can reach any asset attached to his name. I remembered that account Vivian had held onto for 6 years under the excuse of safekeeping for his late father. Money that belonged to a deceased man's son, money his hands had never even touched. George. For the first time since that Sunday, I felt something other than anger, fear, or sorrow. I felt that the words I'd spoken to Preston while my hand was still stinging finally had a tangible shape. It was a real, possible outcome, not just words shouted in heat. Sarah closed her folder, looking at me steadily. I can build this on paper, but paper evidence only takes us so far. George. I need someone who knows how to dig through records, timelines, and past incidents. Someone with zero ties to that police department and no history with that family. I already have someone in mind. I just need to make a call. Sarah's call introduced me to a woman named Elena Rodriguez. She was a detective who had transferred from downtown Atlanta to the neighboring county less than a year ago. George. We met at an old school diner off the highway, neutral ground. Before she even spoke, I noticed her demeanor was completely different from the young officer at the hospital. She was steady, unhurried, and never performed politeness just to please anyone. She had already reviewed the file Sarah sent over, printed it out, tabbed it, and filled the margins with dense notes. George, before we go any further, I want to clear something up, she said, pushing the folder aside. I don't know your family, Mrs. Vance, and I don't know the Sterlings. I've never worked a single case anywhere near that department. That's not an accident. That's exactly why Sarah reached out to me. Is not knowing anyone going to be a problem for you? She almost laughed. George, it's not a problem. It's the biggest advantage. She walked me through the gaps she had spotted purely from the paperwork. The initial report was unusually sparse where it should have been detailed, and Chloe's 2 past R visits, despite doctors flagging concerns both times, showed no record of any police follow-up. She tapped the paper. That isn't careless work. Carelessness is random. George, these gaps are consistent. Every single one points in the same direction. What direction? Someone didn't want to dig too deep, she said plainly, her tone completely devoid of drama, like reading a weather forecast. I've seen this before. Different counties, different families. It doesn't even take money changing hands. George, it just takes everyone liking a person long before a report ever hits their desk. I told her what Martha had shared about the fundraisers, the golf games, and the Christmas parties. Rodriguez nodded, entirely unsurprised. That checks out. The biggest misconception people have about power structures like this is thinking, the system is broken. It isn't. George, for the people on the inside, it's working exactly the way it was designed to. The trick to breaking it is getting someone on the outside to trigger it. Are you that someone? I am. She pulled a form from her folder, an official document, half filled out, requesting access to records. I've reopened this as a formal active investigation on my end. That means I can present it to the DA's office to request court orders forcing the release of those full ER records. I don't need to ask anyone for favors or use personal connections. I just follow standard court procedure like any other case. Hearing that made something shift in my chest again. Not relief, but something much sturdier. For the first time since that hospital hallway, I wasn't watching someone bend the rules for me in secret. I was watching someone use the rules exactly as they were intended, and it was working. Rodriguez closed her folder and looked at me for a long time, her voice dropping lower, more cautious. I need you to understand one thing, Mrs. Vance. Once this order is issued, it won't be quiet anymore. Vivian Sterling will know someone is taking action. A woman who spent 10 years building that kind of reputation isn't going to sit back when she feels it slipping. She looked me dead in the eye. She won't accept this quietly. I'd bet everything I own on that. We sat on the hard wooden benches outside the courtroom, Chloe's hand ice cold in mine, waiting for a name to be called that wasn't ours yet. Sarah had warned me before we walked in. What we were asking for today wasn't the end. It was temporary. A judge could approve it that same day, but it would only hold until the full hearing, where Vivian would get her chance to stand under oath and give her side of the story. Don't view today as the final battle, Sarah whispered, checking her folder one last time. Today is just a foot in the door. Chloe hadn't said much all morning. The car seat rested at her feet, my 3-week-old granddaughter sleeping soundly inside. Every few minutes, Chloe's eyes darted toward the heavy courtroom doors, as if watching for someone who shouldn't be there to walk in. When our case was finally called, everything moved faster than I expected. Sarah presented the facts cleanly. Dr. Miller's medical notes, the subpoenaed past ER records, and a timeline of harm that no reasonable person could call a misunderstanding. The judge barely looked up from the documents, asking only 2 sharp questions that Sarah answered concisely. Then, without any of the dramatic ceremony I had spent all week picturing, she approved it. A temporary restraining order, effective immediately. 0 contact allowed between Vivian, Harper, Chloe, and the baby until the full hearing. I felt my tight shoulders finally drop an inch. Outside the courtroom, another clerk pulled Sarah aside. Preston had been served separately, and his attorney was already requesting a postponement of the underlying civil case, citing schedule conflicts. Sarah didn't even blink. Denied, she said, knowing the answer before reading the note. Judges don't grant delays on cases with this much documented evidence. Watching her say that, a weight finally lifted, one that even Martha's call and Rodriguez's warnings hadn't completely settled. This was real, immediate proof, right there in black and white. Outside the circle Martha had described, beyond every fundraising dinner and Christmas photo, the names Sterling couldn't buy them a single day of grace. But it wasn't over. I knew it wasn't over. Even as I allowed myself a brief moment of breath, I knew a temporary order was just a door propped open, not a lock turning behind us. Ahead lay a full hearing where Vivian would have the power to testify under oath before someone with the authority to undo everything we had just won. Chloe and I walked out into the humid parking lot together, the car seat carried between us as Georgia's thick summer heat settled heavy on our shoulders. For a second, it felt like we could finally breathe. And then her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, then looked up at me, her face pale before she even answered. It was a relative from church. They asked cautiously, with a touch of awkward embarrassment, why Vivian had stood up during announcements that morning to tell half the congregation that Chloe had abandoned her marriage over a misunderstanding and accused me of physically confronting her son in his own mother's home. Chloe lowered her phone slowly, her hands trembling again. but this time it wasn't out of fear of the court. Porch. Mom, she said, her voice laced with desperation. She's already spreading it. She's telling everyone her own version of the story. That Thursday morning, I went to Whole Foods just like I had every Thursday for the past 15 years. Near the produce section, I ran right into Carla Fentress. Porch. Long before our husbands passed, we had sat side by side on the third pew every Sunday listening to the sermon. She spotted me first. A brief look crossed her face. Not surprise, but a sudden defensive guard. Eleanor, she said carefully, testing the ground like checking for thin ice. Porch. Carla, I've heard some rumors this week. She set down the Georgia peaches she was holding, as if clearing her hands for the conversation ahead. Vivian stood up in the prayer circle on Sunday. She told everyone it was all a misunderstanding. She said Chloe has been emotionally unstable since the pregnancy, and that hormones are making her blow things out of proportion. Porch. And she said that you... Carla paused, slowing down to pick her words carefully. That you laid hands on her son in his mother's house. I felt the blood in my veins boil and freeze at the exact same time. That isn't what happened. I didn't say I believed her. Carla's eyes drifted, avoiding mine. I'm just telling you what people are saying. Porch. I wanted so badly to stand right there between the peaches and the kale and tell her everything. The fist to the stomach, Vivian standing up from her chair, shouting orders. But Sarah's voice echoed in my mind, the firm warning from our very first meeting. Do not speak publicly. Do not leave a single record outside the courtroom. As long as this case is moving, keep your mouth shut. Porch. Anything I said right now would just be used by Vivian to paint me as a bitter gossip, trying to interfere with the legal process. So I said nothing. I simply told Carla I appreciated her honesty. I watched her nod, looking almost relieved as she turned away, as if she'd been granted permission to retreat without picking a side in this war. She wasn't the only one. Porch. Over the next few days, I felt that shift in a dozen small ways. A casual Tuesday phone call that never came. A lady from the church altar guild making an excuse to sit 2 seats farther away from me at a meeting. Nobody said anything to my face and nobody needed to. Porch. I fully understood now what Martha had tried to explain weeks ago. The sheer weight of a name that had spent 10 years greasing the right palms. It wasn't just deputies and judges who felt that pull. Anyone who had ever sat at Vivian's table found themselves leaning toward her. And I knew this wasn't Vivian panicking. Porch. Standing in that produce section, I realized a panicking woman doesn't stand in a packed church delivering a story that clean, that composed, hitting every single mark perfectly. This was a strategic move, just like the legal fortress Sarah was building on our side. Vivian's courtroom was just every pew in that sanctuary. Porch. Driving home that afternoon, I felt an emotion I hadn't anticipated in all of this. Loneliness. Not weakness, and not fear exactly, just pure isolation. I was standing alone on one side of the story, while someone else held the microphone firmly on the other. Just as I pulled into the driveway, my phone rang. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. Porch. Eleanor, she said without pleasantries, cutting straight to it. It's done. The civil lawsuit was officially filed and served this morning. Harper, Vivian, and Preston, all 3, received it. Now it's real. The wheels are turning. A few days later, I sat in Sarah's office watching Chloe sign her divorce petition. Her hand didn't shake once, not on the first page and not on the last. Porch. I remember watching her and thinking that in itself was a victory. Seeing my daughter's pen move steadily across a document she never would have believed she'd need 6 years ago. Preston received the divorce papers the same week, served right alongside the civil lawsuit. 2 major legal actions hitting him within days. Sarah had timed it that way on purpose. Porch. Sometimes a man needs to feel the weight of 2 mountains at once for things to become real to him, she said. It worked faster than any of us expected. 2 nights later, Chloe and I were sitting at the kitchen table while the baby slept soundly down the hall in the nursery we'd set up. Chloe looked down at her phone screen and froze. It was Preston. Porch. She let it ring twice before answering, hitting speaker immediately without waiting for me to ask, because since that first week we kept no secrets between us. "You can't do this," he said, skipping any greeting. His voice sounded far thinner than I remembered it in that living room. "Chloe, please, my lawyer told me under no circumstances should I call you, but I had to." "Orch." "You had to," Chloe said, her voice completely flat, perfectly controlled. "The day your sister hit me, you didn't have to do a thing. But now you have to call me. It's not that simple. Actually, it is." She reached for the small notebook she'd been keeping since the week she moved in with me. She flipped open a page, her tone steady. "March. Orch. You told the nurse I tripped on the front porch steps. Preston, we live in a ranch-style house with a completely flat driveway. There are no front porch steps. July. You told them I sprained myself moving boxes. In that house, I was never allowed to move a single box. You wouldn't even pour me a glass of water." Dead silence on the line. A long, heavy pause. "You knew all along," she said. "Orch. Both times you knew it wasn't an accident, and you sat in that waiting room telling lies even you didn't believe." "My lawyer's call is on my other line," he said, his voice dropping lower, almost talking to himself. "He's going to see the record of this call tomorrow. I know what he's going to say to me. But I called anyway." The silence stretched again. "Orch." When he finally spoke, his tone changed, carrying a sudden, broken quality. He said, "I won't lie to you and say I didn't." Sitting across from my daughter, I watched her face as he said those words. Something in her shoulders finally released entirely. It wasn't quite relief. It was more like the sound of a door closing softly, rather than being slammed shut in anger. "Orch. That's the first honest thing you've said to me in a long time," she told him. "I'm not expecting you to fix anything, Preston. I stopped expecting that long ago." She looked up at me across the table, her eyes completely clear. The baby monitor hummed softly between us. "Before this is over, I just needed to hear you say it out loud once." Before he could answer, she hung up. "Orch." She placed the phone face down on the table and let out a long, slow breath. One I felt she'd been holding in her chest since March. She didn't cry. I want to make that clear. There was no forgiveness in that room, nothing soft passing between them. Just a woman who finally saw the truth clearly through an open door, and then shut it for good. Orch. What neither of us knew that night, and what I only learned much later, was that Preston never told his mother he made that call. 8 months have passed since that Sunday in Vivian's living room. By now I've learned one truth. The law never moves at the speed of anger. It moves at the speed of paperwork. Orch. But sitting in a small conference room that morning, watching a court reporter's fingers hover over her machine, I felt the long wait finally catching up to a reckoning. Harper sat across the table, looking far smaller than she had in that living room. Before Sarah even asked a question, Harper's attorney was already whispering in her ear. "Orch." "Miss Sterling," Sarah began, her voice calm, almost politely gentle, the kind of gentleness that makes your skin crawl rather than put you at ease. "How would you describe your relationship with Chloe over the past 6 years?" "Close," Harper said. "We were close. We're family." "Family," Sarah let the word hang in the air for a second. "Orch. Could you tell me about those invoices and vendor statements you brought to her most Sundays? It was just helping out. She's good with numbers. Even when she was 8 months pregnant?" Harper's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Harper didn't answer right away. "Including that Sunday in question," Sarah continued. "Before dinner, you brought a laptop to her. Correct?" "Yes." Orch. According to statements from 3 other family members, that was the 3rd weekend in a row. I don't see how that forms a pattern. The napkin folds, the phone etiquette, the seating arrangements. All of it, going back to before the wedding. Sarah pushed a printed timeline across the table. I watched Harper's eyes track down the document, her jaw tightening with every line. Orch. "Miss Sterling, to me, that doesn't sound like closeness. That sounds like a compliance test she had to pass every single week for 6 years." "Objection," Argumentative, Harper's attorney blurted without even looking up from his legal pad. "If you understand the question, you can answer, Harper." Sarah ignored the objection entirely. "That's not how it was," Harper said, her voice dropping. "George." "Then tell me how it was." The silence stretched so long that even the court reporter paused for a fraction of a second. Harper looked at her lawyer, but he sat still, offering no help. "My mother wanted her handled," Harper finally admitted. "That Sunday," she said Chloe was talking back more often, and needed her discipline handled before dinner. The room went dead silent. "George." Sarah didn't move, didn't even blink, but I could feel her focus sharpen like a blade catching the light. "Your mother instructed you to handle her before that Sunday even began." "That wasn't—" "I didn't think she meant—" "What did you think she meant, Miss Sterling?" Harper couldn't answer. Her lawyer finally leaned in, whispering urgently in her ear, and she stopped talking completely. "George." But it didn't matter anymore. The words were out, recorded forever on that court reporter's machine. It was official now, far sturdier than anything spoken in a living room. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, feeling something solid and final settle in my chest. This wasn't a sudden burst of temper. It wasn't an occasional clash between two people who didn't get along. "George." Vivian had issued an order before that Sunday even started. She sent her daughter in with an assignment, just like handing her a stack of invoices. When the deposition wrapped up and Harper's lawyer rushed her out, Sarah turned to me. For the first time since I met her, I saw something resembling real satisfaction on her face. "George." "That statement," she said, "just turned Vivian's case from bad to a piece of evidence a jury will never forget." Dr. Miller called me directly, something he had never done before, and something in his tone before he even finished his first sentence told me this wasn't a routine follow-up. "Yesterday, someone from our risk management department reached out to me," he said. "George." "They claimed it was routine, a review of medical records regarding ongoing litigation. They wanted to know if, given the time that's passed, I'd be open to clarifying my initial examination findings." "Clarifying," I repeated. That was the word they used. A pause. "I've been doing this a long time, Mrs. Vance." "George." "When a case hasn't even named the hospital as a defendant, risk management doesn't reach out like that. I know what that word means when someone asks me to walk back a signed report. Did you walk it back?" "No," he said without a second of hesitation. "My original report is sitting right in the internal system, dated and time-stamped the night I examined your daughter." "George." "Even if I wanted to change it, I couldn't quietly rewrite it. And frankly, I have zero desire to—" That's exactly what I told them. I held the phone in silence for a long moment, feeling something that wasn't quite fear or anger rolling in my chest. It was the sound of someone trying to grab at something that was already far out of their reach. "George." It slowly clicked in my head that the hospital board held an annual gala every spring. An event Vivian's company had catered for years. Another table of power she had set for herself long before any of this happened. Those connections were close enough to make a call, pressuring a doctor sound like routine business, rather than a direct attempt at tampering. It didn't stop there. "George." 2 days later, Sarah called with more news. A supervisor at the sheriff's department had received a call too. Someone making discreet, roundabout inquiries regarding the officer who took my initial statement, asking if his notes were thorough enough or if they needed to be re-examined in light of current litigation. "George." Detective Rodriguez had caught wind of it before Sarah even had the chance to explain it to me. "She logged it," Sarah said, "formally documented, time-stamped, and added directly to the master file. Eleanor, attempting to pressure witnesses or law enforcement during active litigation isn't just a bad look for them. It's a brand new, independent piece of evidence." "George." I thought back to that scene in the hospital months ago, the deputy's pen freezing over a name. I thought of Martha in her kitchen describing that massive, quiet machine built on favors. That machine had run smoothly for a decade because nobody outside the circle had ever pushed against it hard enough. "George." But now, We were pushing with everything we had, and every time it tried to strike back, it slammed right into a concrete wall. Dr. Miller's report sat firmly where it belonged. Detective Rodriguez had locked the records down months ago through subpoenas. There were no gaps left for a quiet phone call to erase. Porch. Sitting in my kitchen that evening, I finally understood something I hadn't dared believe until that moment. Vivian was no longer running this game. She was being pursued. She was constantly one phone call behind everything we had locked down, and every time she reached out trying to cover her tracks, she was simply proving to everyone watching exactly who she really was. Porch. That Friday, Sarah called again, her voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard before, a cautious, quiet hope. Eleanor, before I say this, I need you to process it carefully because nothing is final yet. But given Harper's testimony, combined with these recent attempts to influence witnesses, I think the pressure on their side has hit a breaking point. They might be coming to us first. Porch. Coming to us for what? A settlement, she said. Before this ever reaches a jury. It has been a year and a half since that Sunday in Vivian's living room. My granddaughter is taking her first unsteady steps now, holding onto the edge of my coffee table as Sarah called us into her office. The next morning, we sat across from Sarah. Porch. Chloe held the baby in her lap, comforting her in the waiting area until the meeting officially started. Sarah didn't beat around the bush. Their attorneys reached out yesterday. They want to settle. All three of them. Harper, Vivian, and Preston. Why now? I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. Because they ran the numbers just like we did. Porch. A jury listening to Harper's testimony, hearing a report on attempts to pressure witnesses during litigation, plus 2 years of documented domestic harm. Their lawyers aren't willing to gamble on those odds in court. She pushed a folder across the desk. Porch. The settlement offer includes direct punitive damages from Harper, a separate emotional distress payout from Vivian, and a settlement amount from Preston. As part of the terms, Preston has agreed to pay his portion directly out of the trust inheritance Vivian held onto for 6 years. His lawyer didn't even put up a fight on that clause. Porch. I think he's simply exhausted from fighting over money that never protected him in the first place. I thought of that account, still bearing his father's name in the background. Money held onto for so long under the guise of safekeeping that it hardly felt like his anymore. Now it was finally moving, just not into his hands. Porch. Before we left the office, Sarah shared one last detail, something she'd heard off the record from opposing counsel. When the settlement terms were laid out on the table, Vivian fell completely silent. No church voice, no composed posture, no rehearsed lines like handing out bulletins on Sunday morning. Just dead quiet. Porch. Then she asked to step out of the room for a few minutes before coming back in to sign the paper. Hearing that, I didn't feel a rush of wild victory. I felt something quieter and far more lasting. The sound of a door finally latching shut. Late that afternoon, we drove home, the baby sleeping peacefully in her car seat. Porch. After Chloe went upstairs to rest, I sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time, turning the folder over in my hands. 18 months since that Sunday. I thought about how far a promise can carry a person if she simply refuses to let go. I remembered the night my granddaughter was born, sitting in that plastic hospital chair, praying to hear her first cry instead of bad news from a doctor. Porch. That night felt so distant now, folded neatly into everything that came after. The following afternoon, Sarah called to confirm the final steps, her voice warm with a satisfaction I hadn't heard from her before. It's done, Eleanor. Signed by all three of them. Processing the funds will take a few weeks, but it's officially moving. Porch. I let out a long, slow breath. One I felt like I'd been holding since that Sunday. Congratulations, truly, she said, her tone then shifting to a careful, businesslike note so as not to linger too long in the moment. But Eleanor, we still need to finalize the custody and child support terms regarding the baby. That part isn't completely wrapped up yet. Porch. I sat at my kitchen table with the final stack of legal documents spread before me, every page signed, stamped, and settled. This was the exact table where Chloe had once turned on the sink faucet just to keep her hands busy when she first told me the truth. The divorce is final. Porch. The restraining order is no longer temporary. It has been extended by court order to cover my granddaughter until further direction from the court. Child support is set through her 18th birthday. Sarah made sure another clause was written in the plainest legal language possible. So plain that I understood it the very first time she read it aloud. Porch. Under Georgia law, once she reaches the age of 14, she will have the legal right to choose which parent's house she calls home. From that point on, nobody can make that decision for her. Not me, not her father, and not a single person carrying the name Sterling. Porch. I ran my fingers along the edge of that page for a long moment, then set my pen down, signing my name right where Sarah had marked. In the second week after everything settled, Preston called one last time. He didn't ask Chloe to reconsider a single thing. He simply asked, in a quiet, formal tone, about visitation procedures, how the process worked, and which days would be appropriate. Porch. Sarah later told me that after that single phone call, his attorney handled every remaining procedural detail. Clean, strictly professional. There was never another private communication between him and Chloe. That felt right. Some doors have to be shut tight, even if you didn't slam them. Later on, I saw Vivian one last time. Porch. From a distance, at the Whole Foods, the very same store where Carla had confronted me in the produce section months ago. Vivian was checking out at the register. I watched the cashier scan her items without that familiar, eager smile I remembered. Without any of the deferential warmth usually reserved for local royalty. It was just an ordinary, unremarkable transaction. Porch. She didn't see me, or if she did, she didn't look my way. And I didn't look for any reason to make her notice me either. A few weeks later, Martha told me that the catering contract for the sheriff's fundraising gala wasn't renewed for Vivian this year. Nobody made a public announcement. The contract was simply handed to someone else quietly. That's usually how it goes. Porch. When a name that once opened every door in this county without question loses its shine, everything unravels without a sound. I thought back to that Sunday, my hand still stinging from those slaps, standing in front of Preston as I made that promise. Back then, I had no idea what fulfilling it would actually cost me. Even if it costs me my life. In the end, it didn't cost me my life. Porch. It cost me a lot of time, a few casual Tuesday phone calls, and a long season of feeling alone in rooms that used to welcome me. But it never made me give up. And somewhere along the way, I finally understood that was all the promise ever really demanded of me. I stacked the paperwork neatly and looked out the kitchen window at the yard. One day, my granddaughter will learn to run on that grass. Porch. Right now, her safety is secured by names written clearly in black and white, stating explicitly who can come near her and who never can again. Vivian Sterling spent 10 years building herself up as a woman beyond question, but those slaps I handed her son were the very last piece of quiet she would ever get on this matter.